Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the difficulties of using volume to train the deadlift. And this is one of the big conflicts that we run into with heavy barbell training, because you have an exercise like the deadlift that is so efficient for recruiting massive amounts of muscle fiber through the entire body. The deadlift works almost every muscle through the entire body. Now, hypothetically, this makes the deadlift an absolutely amazing overall size builder. It should be in theory, but in practice, it's a little harder to pull off than you would think, unfortunately. And ultimately, what that comes down to is the problem of recovery on the deadlift and the amount of workloads that it's capable of generating. And what people need to remember with the deadlift, because the deadlift requires you to pull weights from a dead stop, which is the reason it's so amazing for building so many muscle fibers, because you move an enormous amount of weight through a substantial range of motion, and you have to pull it from a dead stop. It's that pulling it from a dead stop and then following through, with a 2-foot range of motion that makes it so efficient, meaning it makes it recruit so many muscle fibers, because to get the weight started requires maximal muscle fiber recruitment. It requires you, if you're using anything over about 60% of your 1-rep max, there are a lot of muscles in which you have to hit the upper threshold muscle fibers, even with weights that light sometimes, to get it accelerated off the floor with any respectable speed. Now, obviously, all these benefits go away when people start doing it touch and go and things, but if you're pulling from a dead stop on every rep, this is the case. The downside to this is, of course, the fact that it compresses the spine tremendously. There's a huge amount of axial loading involved, and there's a huge amount of upper threshold muscle fiber involvement throughout the entire body from the very start. That beats up your recovery. So there's a couple different ways to approach this, and traditionally what a lot of strength athletes do, and I want people to understand when I say a lot, I don't mean all. There are people on the other extreme who do quite the opposite. They do the exact opposite approach of this successfully. But because of that, you will find that there are many coaches who will have their athletes do this, and many strength athletes who, because the deadlift itself is so taxing, they don't do a lot of deadlifting. They don't use the deadlift to build muscle mass. And that's something that's an interesting point. There are power lifters who don't use the deadlift to build muscle mass, because for them to generate an effective amount of tonnage for them on the exercise due to their own neural efficiency, or at least if they tried to treat it in a traditional sense of the amount of volumes they would do as far as reps and sets versus percentage of their max, they end up burying themselves if they treat it that way. So one strategy is to only deadlift for technique with a relatively low amount of volume. And then you use other exercises to build all the muscles up in the deadlift. Now, this approach can work. Perfect example, you guys remember when I was back in the UK, I had come back to training. I had to take several years away from training. I spent 10 months in bed sick. I rebuilt my deadlift up to 525 very, very fast. But then I wanted to build some other body parts up, and I wanted to build some other lifts up. So I stopped deadlifting for 10 months, right? And I put an extremely heavy focus on squatting. I was squatting 3 days a week. I was doing different sorts of rows 3 days a week. I was doing glute ham raises, right? I did all these exercises to build up my back and my legs and my posterior chain. And I went back after 10 months of not deadlifting, and I pulled 525 again. After 10 months of not doing the lift, and then I pulled like 535 for reps the next workout, then 545. All right, so my deadlift basically went up. It didn't at first because I had to relearn the motor pattern, but I gained 20 pounds on my deadlift from 2 workouts of practicing the lift again after 10 months of not doing it, right? My old max at that point went up 20 pounds with 10 months of not practicing the exercise by building the other muscles up. And that approach works. It works for many successful lifters. There are a lot of power lifters I've known who pull 700 in comp who don't even deadlift 600 in training. They use other exercises. People use rows, various squats, power cleans to build all those muscles up, because the deadlift is not a highly technical lift. It's not an extremely skill-dependent exercise. And it's like riding a bike. It takes just a few. Once you learn the technique perfect on a deadlift, you can stop doing it a while and come back and relearn the technique again perfectly within a few weeks. The deadlift is usually limited by your weakest muscle. The amount of weight you can pull on a deadlift for your given frame is going to depend on how big and how strong everything from your spinal erectors to your mid-traps to your glutes to your hamstrings. How strong all of these muscles are will determine what you can pull. And the deadlift, since it uses so many muscles, the more muscles that you have between your calves and your traps and everything in between that are strong, the more weight you're going to pull. And if you take any of those muscles that's even remotely lagging and you thicken it up, your deadlift's going to go up 10 pounds. It's going to go up 20 pounds, right? Doesn't matter what muscle it is. You improve any of those muscles, your deadlift goes up. It sometimes doesn't even need to be the weakest muscle in the chain. Improving any of those muscles will improve your deadlift. Now, the other approach, we see people on the far other extreme who say, okay, that's fine, and I could do it that way, but I want a deadlift. I want to maintain a better skill on the deadlift, and I want to use the deadlift to build muscle. One of the strategies I've noted is that they avoid extreme intensity that you would think of, meaning they'll do singles with 90%, right? Singles with 90%, not 100%. So in other words, if your max is 550, they won't do more than 500 for a rep. And if they're going to do 3 reps, they might drop it all the way down to 450 to 475. Case in point, you guys remember when I was doing high volume deadlifting back last year? I was filming all of it. In fact, the footage in this video is from it. I'm doing a lot of volume with sub 500 pound pulls. Now, if you guys remember, I walked in and what was I doing for peak sets? I was doing 515 for 5 rep sets on camera before I switched over to the high volume. But I was only doing 1 or 2 work sets per week. I had to drop under 500 to do triples, and then I had to build volume. But it worked. It worked by doing 6, 7, 8 sets of 3 with a weight that I'm probably capable of pulling for 8 reps. So again, we're not dealing with a lot here. I was able to improve my deadlift again. I was able to hypertrophy all the muscles involved. And I was able to fine-tune my technique a bit, get my bar pass down, my leverages down, by doing the high volumes of fast pulling with, quite frankly, reps that were fairly low for the amount of intensity I was using. But it allowed for perfect technique, and not only honing the technique, but it allowed for a large accumulation of metabolic fatigue with very fast reps. Because remember, bar speed, if we talk about the studies we looked at yesterday, affect upper threshold fibers. The faster you pull, the more muscle fibers you recruit. And that's true even if you're pulling an 8 rep max for triples, right? If you pull it fast enough, you're still hitting those upper threshold fibers, particularly on an exercise like the deadlift. But there are also people who, again, will do high volumes of singles with 90%. When used in this manner, you can do higher volume deadlifting, you can get the skill training, which is what you're seeking, and you can get metabolic fatigue to put muscle on. And it will put a lot of muscle on in a lot of spots in the body because the deadlift works so many muscles. So this is an approach that also works. And what I would say to people, people say, well, you got to find what works for you. No, that's not true. Both of these methods work. Both of these methods will work for pretty much everyone. It's a matter of which one can you tolerate to do. Psychologically, where are you at in your training? And at different points, you might find that both of these approaches work for you at different times. I've successfully used both. Lots of people have successfully used both, but there are also people who stick to just one or the other. And what I would say to people is step back and assess what you're trying to do with it. Because one perk of the deadlift is that it can replace a lot of your accessory work. If you can come in and do a lot of high volume deadlifting and still balance the recovery, and that's the tricky part because you will bury yourself very, very easily. That's the downside. The less experienced lifter will overtrain doing this because they don't know what to watch for. They'll overreach and they won't know when to back down. And when they mess up, they'll be buried. They'll lose weeks of progress. So sometimes their strength will go down for 2 or 3 weeks till they figure it out. And it'll affect every other lift they do. Their squat will go down, their weighted chin-ups will go down, everything will. So if you can balance it out, it's a viable method for overall hypertrophy if you want lower amounts of exercise selection. But if a person wants to do a little more exercise selection, they don't want to quite risk the burying themselves on the heavy deadlifting, the other approach works. The other approach definitely works also, of keep the deadlift volume very low and use other big exercises just to hypertrophy all the muscles in the deadlift. Like I said, each approach is different. Each approach is going to work for different people in different phases more so than others. And for anyone out there, I would say just step back and honestly assess what you want out of your training and your deadlift training when picking which one you want to do. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.